Good afternoon. I'm going to tell you now a story about a young man. Young man came to our hospital, 30 years old, with some knee problems. And he went in the operating room and they planned a kind of arthroscopy for him. You know, you make a small incision in your knee, and then you put in this fiber optic cable in his knee. Then you look around, see what's wrong, perhaps fix it, let the patient wake up, and walk home. During the operation, suddenly things go wrong. The heart starts beating in an irregular fashion, then it stops. The anesthesiologist has to give major drugs. Then they start pounding on his chest to get some pressure done, like for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, no big effect. Then they bring the patient to the X-ray room to see if we can do some diagnostics, and they call the heart surgeon. Excellently, I was on call at that time. And I went into this X-ray room, and there was this standardized turmoil of 10 or 12 people, some of them pounding on the chest of this young patient. And you saw some pressure waves on the screen, and you realized this young patient was dying. And then you're in a situation which is, and I was 28 years then, which is a little uncomfortable, because at that time we didn't have emergency room, we didn't have Grey's Anatomy to tell us what to do in these situations. So I'm a cardiac surgeon, I need an operating room, I need equipment, I need a team. And I was there, and in an X-ray room, no equipment, no team. There was just one small blade there. Blade, perhaps I bring it, like this. And some of the nurses had some scissors in her coat, like this. And what could I do? So I took this knife and cut the skin of the patient down to the sternum, took the scissors and cut open the sternum, spread the sternum, and there was the heart, not doing anything. So I started squeezing the heart and pumping, and unfortunately you never had the feeling of a heart in your hands. The feeling if something happens, and certainly this is a feeling you should experience, but you probably never do. And the heart the heart suddenly starts contracting again, very slowly, and more and more vigorously, and it comes back. And you see the unbelievable, hopeful eyes of your team, and you see also the pressure wave coming back on the screen. This patient went home a week later with a big scar on the front of his chest, a small 1 centimeter scar in his knee, and he was wondering a little. We told him. Well, in medicine, in heart surgery, we sometimes have to make decisions within minutes, within seconds, not more. And death is imminent in heart surgery. It's always there, even if you don't expect it, if you don't calculate it. We calculate probabilities before every operation. We put in risk scores in computers and calculate risk. We have these risk calculations on the back of our minds with experience. And then, after these calculations, we go on and follow our plan. Very rational. And then sometimes there are these gut decisions out of your belly within seconds. And you need actually both of these ways of deciding, because the ones are calculated and the other ones are not. And the non-calculated decisions are probably bravery, what you call bravery or courage. And the thing which we did in this young man probably would call as brave. But think about if it doesn't come to a good end, if the patient will die, then they will tell you, you're stupid, you're irresponsible. So the small line between stupidity and bravery sometimes is very small. And there's this tightrope act between death and life in our profession. You only know that you have crossed it when the patient is dead. So I was brought up in times between the age of pioneers in heart surgery. Some of them my famous teachers, and my times, modern times, standardized operating procedures, calculated risks, very low risk. In the times of these pioneers, survival was good luck, 50% survival or so. In our times, survival is normal. So, bravery, does it still have time? Or is there time for bravery? I think bravery and courage are always connected with some other things, like conscience, for instance. Conscience always has to be there. And conscience makes us aware, alert, and it helps you in seeing all these pop-ups in the back of our brain and popping up solutions, how you could do it. The alternative pops up also, but it helps you. And what you also need is, you need values. If you decide in such a situation without being based on values, it's foolishness. So connecting bravery with values, then you, I think, on the right way. I think if you think about what you could do and what's the cost and the outcome, and you do it anyway, then it's bravery. If you don't calculate it and you just do it, perhaps for self-interest or for fame, then it's foolishness. So I'm actually an expert in aortic surgery. The aorta is this big vessel coming out of the heart, making here an arch, going down to the rest of the body and bringing blood down to the body. In the aortic arch, 3 vessels go up, to the brain, to the arms, and to the spinal cord. And sometimes we have aneurysms there. Aneurysms are enlarged arteries. Sometimes the aorta, which is normally 3 centimeters big, is like 8, 9, 10 centimeters wide. And these aneurysms tend to rupture. When they rupture, the patient drops dead immediately. That's what we want to avoid, and then we operate on these patients. And the usual procedure, like 10, 15, 20 years ago, we put the patient on a heart-lung machine and cooled the patients down to 18 degrees centigrade. Then we stopped the heart, we stopped the circulation. And I mean, we stopped the circulation. There was no blood running through the body for 1 hour. And then you can imagine this is kind of a challenge, because you kind of have to rush to finish your operation, and this is really a challenging operation. So some people in the world, and I was one of them, developed new methods in avoiding this, stopping the circulation. And one day I performed one of these operations, and an older man with a big aneurysm tended to rupture. I informed him about this new type procedure, I informed the family, we performed the operation. It was a success. Great, you think. Well, I almost got fired. Because I didn't inform my boss, who was out of town. I didn't inform the system. And that was my mistake. That was foolish, because I should have known it, that I will get in conflict with the system. And by not doing so, I saved the patient's life, but I almost got fired. So I think there should be a third way besides bravery and foolishness. It should be a kind of skilled or educated courage. I think you should know everything, what is possible in the way you decide in a couraged way. So on another occasion, I was on my mountain bike, not in the operating room, in the Alps with some friends. And we were already traveling for a few days, and it was really tough. I got some gastrointestinal problems, vomiting and all this very unpleasant stuff. And we came to the foothill of the Alps, and we wanted to go up to a hut, 1,000 meters of altitude higher, 10 kilometers away, on the border between Austria and Italy. So my friends were already far away, and it started raining, and I started vomiting again, and I knew I had to go up there and didn't want to, because I was tired. And it started snowing, and I couldn't go back, because on the next day, we all would go together to Italy and further on. So I decided, well, if I just go step by step, if I have to push my bike all the way up, if I take 100 rests, at a certain time, after a few hours, I will come up there. And so I started. I was shivering and it was really miserable. But after a while then, I came around the corner and I saw the hut. In 30 minutes I was up there, had my shower, had my food, and after some recuperation time it was great. And it was this feeling of success that you did it despite all the obstacles. A few weeks later I was operating on a very old man, very fragile tissues, very challenging operation. And it was technically really difficult, also aortic arch. And then we let the blood flow through the arteries again. It was a disaster. Blood everywhere, sutures torn out, everything fell apart. And it was already after 6 or 7 hours operation. So then you're in a kind of a miserable situation because you know, actually, this patient has to die. And everything was in vain. Because if you would go on, you would have to redo everything. And in an old patient, redoing everything doubles the operation time, and the risk will go up sky high. So your only intention is just leave, go home, drink a beer or two or even more. Anyway, it's not possible because it's the patient's life. So I sat down and thought about the situation for a few minutes. And then I recalled the situation at the foothills of this mountain. And I thought about the hut up in the mountains. And I thought about the feeling which I had when I came up there and on the way up there. And then I knew I had to do it again, and I can do it, even if I make stitch by stitch the whole procedure again. And the patient came out of the operation room alive and went home. That was a lot of luck, and it was not foreseeable, but without doing that, he would never had the chance. Another patient, 40 years old, another guy had operated on this patient. And in the evening, I was on duty. I was called in. Patient had a dying heart, massive infarction. And we made some diagnostics and looked in, and we saw that this new valve blocked the arteries which supported the heart with blood. So I went back in, made some bypass surgery to bring in some new blood, but it was too late. The infarction was already done, and there was no more help for this heart. So this 40-year-old man dying, if we would say, okay, and go out of the operating room, he would have been dead. By that time, I already had quite a lot of experience with the development of artificial hearts. And we've developed our own artificial heart, but it was relatively new. So I had this decision to make, either employ this new procedure or let the patient die. Operate till midnight or later, or let the patient die. So we implanted this new heart. Patient went home with his artificial heart and became a transplant a few weeks later. So it's always a matter of knowledge, skills, and decision, and courage. And I think, especially in science, courage and decision and risk-making is always connected with the risk of the patient also. Because if you compare 1969, the first trip to the moon, and the same year the first heart transplant. These three guys who went to the moon, they took their own risk. They went up there and knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing on their own risk. The team who made the first heart transplant had no risk. When they knew if they would succeed, they had the fame. But the guy which they transplanted had the risk. So that's what we always need to know. And especially if we know that we get into conflict with the interest of the patient. Because nowadays we can almost do everything in heart surgery, but sometimes the patient wouldn't stand it because it's too old or too fragile. So if we go for the optimum, the state of the art, the maximum procedure, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is for the benefit of the patient. We have to go for the minimal harm, for the maximal benefit of the patient. And sometimes it takes courage to say, okay, we just do a minimum, or okay, we just don't do anything. We let the patient die, or we treat the patient in a conservative way. To give you an example for that, a few months ago, my mother called me. And she has had very bad times the last months. She was like 80 years old, and she on the phone, she had terrible voice, almost no breath, short of breath, and the last months before had several episodes of the shortness of breath and kidney failures. And she told me, "You have saved my life twice during the last 3 months. Please do it again." And I said, okay, called the hospital, called the ambulance. She was brought in the hospital. Next morning they called me, "It's getting worse," which was expected. "We have to intubate her, put her on the respirator. But perhaps she's going to die if we do that." And I say, okay, do it, because otherwise she will suffocate. And if she dies on the respirator, it's a death which is okay. But if you suffocate, that's terrible. And if you just proceed and go on and give her any medication you can give, that's not fair. So they put her on the respirator. I went into the car and started driving for the next 400 kilometers. And after 1 hour, they called me that she has died. I think this was the right decision, to stop. At a certain point, we have to stop. And I think we have to be decent over the years. If I look back at all my years, or the last 20, 30 years, I would sometimes wonder how aggressive was it the first time. Because now I'm capable of doing a lot of things. Now I'm expert in some fields, and I can do a lot. But now I'm much more decent, and I know there's also destiny. And we sometimes can't beat nature, and sometimes we can beat destiny, and that gives you a feeling of pride and satisfaction. And I'm very thankful that I could have this feeling quite often. But then sometimes you have to admit victory of nature. But to make the right decisions, I think we can train things. We can acquire skills to make the right decisions, not to make foolish decisions or brave decisions. I think you can make educated courage decisions. And for that you can acquire algorithms to make the right decisions. You can make team training, you can do mental training. Sometimes you even have to step back and say, okay, it's too hard for me now. I had so many complications, so many loss of lives. I have to make a pause. And then I go into the woods, do some training, get some mental strength, and then I go back to the operating room, do some easy cases, and then I get a friend and say, okay, let's do a tough case again. And I think with this approach, you get more safe. You get a lot of risk out of it. And if I ask you a question, or how would you do in a situation where you have to decide between life and death, and you know if you would take time to make the decision, it would mean death, how would you decide? I think it's very important to ask for forgiveness and not for permission. Then you could have success, like I had in this operation where I almost got fired, but I saved a human's life. And I think if you would acquire this educated courage for you, it will help you in your life. And I would invite you to follow this path, and I thank you very much for your attention.